October 12, 1944. Before the sun split the horizon, a freight of khaki and steel rolled off the rail spur and coughed dust into the pre-dawn air around Camp Ruston. The chain-link fences glinted with morning dew. Guard towers cut thin silhouettes against a sky that smelled faintly of river mud and diesel. Lieutenant Harold M. Jensen, thin, spectacles fogged, a clipboard tucked under his arm, watched the last car disgorge a line of men stiff in the cold light. He could see their breath, white puffs like ghosts that hesitated before vanishing. Sergeant Wilhelm Willi Bauer stood among them, coat buttoned to his throat, cap pulled low. He was 32, held together by an old Luftwaffe overcoat and a steady, incredulous stare. The train had been a rumor thing, a corrugated nightmare that ended here on American soil, with a blue sky and southern birdsong that mocked the mud of Stalingrad and the rattle of Messerschmitt engines. Bauer's rank stripes, Hauptfeldwebel, were bent but visible beneath grime. His field belt still carried a battered canteen and the stub of a cigarette pack. His hands twitched like a pianist's at the thought of fingering strangers' instruments. Around the platform, American MPs in olive drab, caps bristling with authority, moved like a choreography, inspecting, cataloging, separating. Corporal James Jimmy O'Connor, 26, still smelling of motor oil from his previous job at a Memphis repair shop, barked orders and pointed to a table where pencils scratched down names and serial numbers. He carried a .45 holster at his hip and a field map folded in the breast pocket of his jacket. Nearby, a clipboard-clutching officer, Captain Eleanor Briggs, one of the very few women commissioned in the camp administration, stepped forward with an official calm that unsettled some of the prisoners. She wore a neat uniform, hair rolled under her cap, a pair of wire-rimmed glasses that made her look like a schoolmistress rather than a wartime officer. Bauer's boots hit the gravel like a metronome. He had been trained to read landscapes for danger, a slant here, a depression there. This landscape offered no shell holes, only neat rows of barracks, a barbed crown, and the vast, impossible American sky. A child's voice in a tinny radio played a tune, "I'm Getting Sentimental Over You," and it threaded through the moment like an apology. Bauer's comrade, Unteroffizier Dietrich Krebs, whispered a question about how long they would be held. No one answered. Instead, an American interpreter, Private First Class Miguel Alvarez, fluent in broken High German and full Germanic surnames, stepped in, the pocket of his jacket stuffed with phrase books. His smile was quick but exhausted. They were lined up and made to surrender things: knives, maps, a pocket Bible, the last photograph of a young woman in a sailor's blouse. The American soldiers handled the items with a practical politeness, like a mechanic handling a delicate engine part. Lieutenant Jensen recorded names, and a printer's clack echoed as ID numbers were stamped into browns and blues. Bauer felt the numbness clamp down on his limbs as he watched the men around him. Some hugged their caps to their chests. Others stared at the ground with a distant focus that suggested escape or the returning of maps. The inspection moved toward more bureaucratic procedures, medical checks, inoculations with hypodermic clicks that made men flinch, and the intake of personal histories. Captain Briggs asked questions in clipped English and translated through Alvarez into German. Name, unit, last rank, any wounds, any political affiliations. The camp documentation team moved like a precise machine. Blank forms, fountain pens, official stamps with an eagle that was not the German eagle, and a sternness that reassured the guards more than it frightened the prisoners. When Bauer was measured and catalogued, he noticed an unexpected detail, a flyer tucked into the packet of instructions handed to him. It was printed on quality paper, not the thin, wartime ration stock he'd learned to expect. The type was bold. United States Army Education Program, courses in English. By the third week, the strangeness had become routine. Roll call at dawn, breakfast at 0600, powdered eggs, coffee strong enough to wake the dead, and work assignments split between maintenance, farming, and what the Americans called cultural orientation. The phrase made most of the German prisoners laugh quietly into their tin mugs. But the laughter faded when they saw what orientation really meant, Hauptfeldwebel. Bauer found himself standing in front of a clapboard building marked Education Hall. A hand-painted sign beside the door listed the day's schedule in English and German. 9 Bauer, English language. 10 U.S. history. 14 Agriculture and soil science. Inside, the hall smelled faintly of chalk, tobacco, and new pine. Rows of mismatched desks faced a blackboard already scrawled with simple English words: tree, freedom, work, vote. The instructor was a civilian in his early 40s, wearing suspenders and a tie patterned with tiny airplanes. His name was Professor Alan Whitmore, formerly of Louisiana State University, now attached to the U.S. Army's Special Projects Division. "Good morning, gentlemen," he began, his voice firm but not unfriendly. "You've been through hell. This isn't about punishment. It's about rebuilding." The men exchanged looks. Dietrich whispered, "Rebuilding what?" Bauer didn't answer. He watched Whitmore as the professor drew a rough map of North America on the board and began explaining the Mississippi River, the Great Lakes, and how the United States had built itself on migration and work. The irony wasn't lost on them. These were soldiers of a nation that had spent years declaring its superiority, now being lectured about the virtues of democracy by their captors. Yet the mood was not hostile. Some men took notes eagerly, practicing English letters in their notebooks with the same discipline they had once used for weapons maintenance logs. Others slouched, skeptical but listening. Bauer found himself oddly drawn in when Whitmore started talking about post-war reconstruction. "The war will end," Whitmore said, chalk squeaking across the board. "And when it does, Germany will need men who can build bridges, not burn them. You can choose whether you'll be one of those men." The words hung in the room like gunsmoke. Even the guards stationed at the back shifted their weight uneasily. After class, the prisoners were allowed an hour in the camp library, a converted mess hall lined with donated books. Old American novels, engineering manuals, and dictionaries filled the shelves. Bauer thumbed through a copy of The Grapes of Wrath, the pages soft and yellowed, and tried to imagine an American farmer reading it by lamplight. The guard O'Connor passed by and said, "Good book. Hard times, same as yours." Bauer nodded, unsure if he was being mocked. But O'Connor's face was sincere. Later, vocational training began for those who volunteered. Machine repair, carpentry, even photography. The workshops clattered with drills and saws while an American sergeant, previously a high school shop teacher, supervised with easy patience. Bauer's hands remembered precision, the delicate balancing of airplane instruments, and he quickly gained a reputation as one of the camp's best mechanics. It earned him privileges, extra library time, a lighter work detail, and occasional conversations with Whitmore, who had taken a personal interest in the older sergeant's quiet intelligence. One evening after the day's classes, Whitmore lingered by the workshop bench while Bauer tightened the bolts of a broken typewriter. The professor said softly, "You know, Sergeant Bauer, some of the men here will take university courses through correspondence next month. The Red Cross is coordinating it with the University of Kansas. Would you like to try?" Bauer froze mid-turn. "University? For prisoners?" Whitmore smiled faintly. "For men. Education is never wasted." That night, Bauer brought the news to the barracks. The reactions were mixed. Some men laughed, some cursed, others looked uncertain. Otto Kruger, the pragmatic sergeant, muttered, "Next they'll have us reading American poetry." Dietrich, younger and restless, said, "Maybe that's the point. They want to turn us into Americans." Bauer looked at the flyer again, the list of correspondence subjects. Mechanical engineering, English composition, civics, political philosophy. He traced the words with his finger. "Maybe they just want to see if we're capable of being human again," he said quietly. Outside, the camp loudspeakers played faint swing music from a nearby rec hall. The night smelled of pine and rain, and for the first time since capture, the camp did not feel like a cage but a strange, temporary school built behind wire and watchtowers. The next morning, when the guards opened the gates for work detail, Bauer carried his tools with a new sense of purpose. He didn't yet believe in Whitmore's America, but he had begun to believe in something else, that learning might be another way to survive. By December 1944, Camp Ruston had changed. What had begun as a routine internment compound now hummed like a small college campus hidden behind wire and rifles. Snow never quite touched Louisiana, but the air had turned sharp and damp, and the camp's loudspeakers often played Glenn Miller or Benny Goodman to keep spirits high. For the German POWs, the strange symphony of wartime America, swing music, ration trucks, laughter from the officers' club was something both alien and intoxicating. Bauer's mornings were now dictated not by guard whistles but by class schedules. He rose early, shaved meticulously, and joined a group of 20 men who had enrolled in the correspondence courses. The Red Cross had delivered stacks of printed lessons, and the University of Kansas had provided the rest. Examination papers, reading lists, even typewritten feedback from professors hundreds of miles away. Each assignment bore the crest of an American university, an emblem that seemed to glimmer with absurd prestige amid the mud and fencing. Professor Whitmore and Captain Briggs oversaw the program together. Briggs, pragmatic and quietly ambitious, saw education as a strategic weapon. She called it psychological reconstruction. Whitmore preferred the word enlightenment. Between them, the camp's schoolhouse became a microcosm of America's wartime ideology, a place where democracy was taught not as a lecture, but as a lived experience. Inside the classroom, the men studied everything from literature to engineering. Dietrich, who had scoffed at the start, was now absorbed in the Federalist Papers, struggling through the English but fascinated by the arguments about liberty and power. Otto Kruger built model bridges out of wood in the engineering course, muttering about tensile strength as though he'd been born a builder, not a soldier. And Bauer, who once calculated fuel ratios for Luftwaffe bombers, spent hours reading about soil composition, crop rotation, and American agriculture. He would often look out the classroom window, where an expanse of red earth stretched into the Louisiana horizon. "You could grow anything here," he once murmured. Whitmore overheard him and replied, "That's the point, Sergeant. Even ideas can take root in the right soil." Not everyone welcomed the change. Some prisoners saw the classes as propaganda, a veiled attempt to erode their German identity. At night, in the quieter corners of the barracks, small circles formed around men who still clung to the old ideology. They whispered about honor, about loyalty to the fatherland, about how this re-education was a slow poison meant to soften them before surrendering their souls. One of them, a young lieutenant named Horst Reiner, had served in the Waffen-SS. He carried himself with rigid pride, even in captivity. "They want you to believe you're free men," he told Bauer one night, voice low and sharp. "But you're still behind their fence. Their kindness is another kind of control." Bauer didn't argue. He only said, "Control or not, I've learned more in 2 months here than in 10 years under the Reich." Horst's eyes flashed. "That's exactly what they want you to say." The conversation ended there, but the thought lingered like a bruise. The next morning, when Bauer attended the history class, he caught himself looking at the American flag pinned above the blackboard. The fabric rippled in the draft from an open window. He wondered how many of his countrymen could have imagined that flag fluttering inside a German POW camp. In the afternoons, the men worked on vocational projects, building furniture for local schools, repairing engines, crafting small machines for the nearby army depots. It wasn't slavery. They were paid a few cents per day, enough to buy cigarettes or writing paper at the camp store. But the real reward came in the form of pride. Useful work, not the humiliation of idleness. When the Christmas season came, the camp hosted a small concert. The German prisoners performed choral pieces from Bach and Beethoven, while American guards joined in with harmonicas and guitars. For one night, the boundaries blurred. Captain Briggs gave a brief speech. "Education and music share one thing. They make men civilized, even in war." Bauer sang that night, his baritone rising with the others in a solemn rendition of Stille Nacht. The guards stood respectfully. When the song ended, there was silence, then a soft round of applause that seemed to echo from both sides of the fence. Later, back in the barracks, Bauer opened one of his correspondence lessons and read a passage on civic responsibility. It spoke of nations built not by obedience but by cooperation. He stared at the words for a long time before closing the folder and blowing out the candle. Outside, frost glittered on the fence like thin silver thread. The camp was quiet except for the hum of a generator and the occasional bark of a sentry's dog. Bauer lay awake thinking not of the war but of what might come after. In a strange way, behind the wire, he was beginning to feel freer than he ever had before. By February 1945, the war in Europe was entering its violent crescendo. But in Louisiana, the days passed with a steady rhythm: class, work, study, reflection. Word reached the camp sporadically, carried through Red Cross newsletters and intercepted radio snippets. Dresden had been bombed. The Allies were across the Rhine. The men listened in silence, their faces a mosaic of disbelief, grief, and quiet shame for Bauer and his fellow students. Those headlines hung like invisible weights over every discussion. Professor Whitmore never mentioned battlefield news directly, but his lectures grew subtly bolder. When a nation is blinded by its leaders, he said one morning, pacing before the blackboard, its people must learn to see again through education. That's what democracy demands, a citizen who thinks. It was a dangerous sentence to say aloud in a camp full of former Nazis, but the silence that followed wasn't hostile, it was contemplative. Even Horst, the defiant SS lieutenant, didn't speak. He just stared at the board, jaw tight. The re-education curriculum had evolved. Beyond English and vocational training, the prisoners now attended discussion sessions. These were moderated debates on philosophy, economics, and ethics. At first they were formal, stiff exchanges full of rehearsed talking points. But as weeks passed, the debates grew lively, even passionate. Men who once followed orders without question were now arguing about the limits of state power, about justice, about the meaning of freedom. Bauer had emerged as one of the most articulate participants. His English was still halting, but his ideas were sharp. During one discussion, Whitmore asked the class to define freedom. Freedom, Bauer said after a long pause, is when a man can speak truth without being afraid of the knock at his door. The room was still. Even the guards at the back glanced at him. Whitmore nodded slowly. That, he said, is the heart of it. Letters from home began to arrive that spring. The U.S. authorities permitted POWs to write and receive mail under strict censorship, and the Red Cross distributed the envelopes every Thursday. The handwriting was faint, the paper thin. Bauer received one from his sister in Bremen. Short, fragmented sentences that spoke of hunger, of blackouts, of the fear of Russian advance. She asked if he was alive, if he had food, if America was as cruel as the propaganda had said. He wrote back carefully, I am alive. We are treated fairly. They have schools here. They teach us about democracy, about what happens when power belongs to people, not to fear. It is strange. It makes me think. The next week he showed Whitmore the letter before sending it. Will they believe it? Bauer asked. Whitmore smiled faintly. They might not, but truth has to start somewhere. Meanwhile, Captain Briggs compiled reports for Washington. Her dispatches described the Ruston model, an experiment in humane captivity that combined discipline with education. She noted measurable shifts in prisoner morale, improved behavior, and growing curiosity about democratic principles. These men were soldiers of totalitarianism, she wrote, but in learning they begin to unlearn. Some of the prisoners even volunteered to assist in teaching others. Dietrich helped newer arrivals learn basic English phrases. Kruger oversaw small workshops in woodcraft and mechanical drawing. The Americans noticed that the more responsibility the Germans were given, the fewer guards were needed to maintain order. Still, not everyone was ready to accept this strange peace. One evening, as Bauer left the classroom after a lecture on the U.S. Constitution, Horst Reiner confronted him near the gate. You're fooling yourself, Horst said, voice tight with bitterness. You think they're saving your soul? They're studying you. Every answer you give goes in a report. Maybe, Bauer replied. But even if they are, I'm learning more about what I believe and what I don't than I ever did under Himmler. Horst spat on the dirt, his face pale in the floodlight. You'll go home soft. They'll break you with kindness. Bauer didn't answer. He just looked up at the guard tower where an MP stood smoking, watching them both. Maybe kindness isn't a weapon, he said quietly. Maybe it's something we forgot how to use. That night, Bauer couldn't sleep. The argument replayed in his mind, tangled with fragments of Whitmore's lectures and the words of his sister's letter. He thought of the boys who would never return from the Eastern Front, of the cities turned to ash, of the promise, however fragile, that men could be remade through thought rather than fear. The next morning, when the American flag rose over the compound, the German prisoners stood as they always did, silent and still. But Bauer noticed something different in the faces around him. Not submission, not resentment, but curiosity. A question flickered there, unspoken but alive. What if the enemy had something worth learning? The war was still raging oceans away, but inside Camp Ruston, another kind of battle was already being won. Not with bullets, but with books. April 30th, 1945. The news came down the wire like a thunderclap. Hitler was dead. The announcement spread through Camp Ruston in fragments, first whispered in English among the guards, then carried in hurried German across the yard. By noon it was official. The warlord whose portrait had once hung in every German barrack and classroom was gone, self-inflicted in a bunker hundreds of miles away. When the news reached the education hall, Professor Whitmore stood quietly at his desk, looking out the window where sunlight bled across the Louisiana pines. The German prisoners filed in unusually silent. Even the defiant ones, like Horst Reiner, sat with hands folded and eyes downcast. Whitmore set aside his notes and said, "Today, history changed. What happens next will depend on what you choose to believe in." No one answered. A few minutes later, one man, a thin artillery corporal named Heinrich Weller, rose slowly and said, "Does that mean we are free?" Whitmore met his gaze. "Not yet, but maybe one day soon." That night the camp felt strangely hollow. The radio in the guardhouse played somber American coverage of Germany's surrender, the announcer's voice cracking under the weight of the words unconditional capitulation. The prisoners sat in stunned silence. Some cried openly. Others stared into the dark, their entire identity, built on obedience to a now vanished Führer, crumbling inward. For Bauer, the news struck like an earthquake that somehow felt inevitable. He walked the perimeter under the faint glow of searchlights, his boots crunching over gravel. The fence no longer seemed like the true barrier. The real prison had been the idea of Germany he had carried with him, rigid and blind. A few nights later, he found Whitmore in the workshop, still grading papers. "You must be pleased," Bauer said quietly. "Your democracy has won." Whitmore looked up from the stack. "No one wins in a war like this, Sergeant. But maybe the world has a chance to learn something before it destroys itself again." The following weeks unfolded in strange calm. The re-education classes shifted focus. Instead of learning English grammar or American civics, the men studied Reconstruction. How to rebuild cities, how to organize free elections, how to write letters to their families in the ruins. The University of Kansas expanded its correspondence program, offering new courses on public administration, agriculture, and basic medicine. Captain Briggs addressed the camp in early May, reading an official statement from Washington. "Germany has surrendered. You are now prisoners of peace." That phrase stuck in Bauer's mind. Prisoners of peace. It felt paradoxical but right. Soon after, mail delivery resumed with renewed urgency. Letters came describing hunger, bombed-out homes, and desperate relatives scavenging for bread. The men who had spent months learning about democracy now faced its hardest truth. Freedom did not feed you. Rebuilding would take work, discipline, patience. All the things they had once used for war now turned toward life. Some men grew restless. They wanted to go home, to dig their families out of rubble. Others feared what they would return to, whether Germany would even exist as they remembered it. Yet amid the uncertainty, the education program became their anchor. In one of the final classes, Whitmore asked them to write essays answering a single question: what should Germany become? Bauer stayed up half the night working on his response. The next morning, he handed in a neatly written page that read, "Germany should not be mighty. It should be wise. It should be a country that builds instead of conquers, that listens instead of commands. If I return home, I want to teach my son how to make something with his hands, not how to salute." Whitmore read it silently, then placed it on the top of the pile. "That," he said softly, "is a kind of victory too." When Germany's surrender was formally celebrated in the U.S., the Americans in Camp Ruston held a small gathering. The POWs were invited to attend if they wished. Bauer went. He watched the guards dance awkwardly to the crackling tunes of "Don't Sit Under the Apple Tree," saw them drink watered-down whiskey and laugh, and for the first time, he understood something Whitmore had tried to teach all along. Democracy was messy, imperfect, even ridiculous at times, but it was alive. That night, back in the barracks, Bauer wrote another letter to his sister. "They are letting us study more. They talk of sending us home soon. America is strange, but I think it is strong because its people argue and still shake hands after. Perhaps one day we will do the same." He folded the letter, sealed it, and handed it to the Red Cross courier the next morning. Outside, the guard towers still stood. The fences still glinted in the sun. But something in the air had changed. The camp was no longer a place of defeat. It was a chrysalis, September 1946. The war had been over for more than a year, but Camp Ruston still held its quiet rhythm. Rows of barracks weathered under the southern sun, their wood bleached pale and dry. The guard towers stood mostly empty now, symbols without purpose. The fences still circled the camp, but even the barbed wire sagged as if tired of keeping men inside. The repatriation orders had begun to arrive in batches that summer. Every few weeks, names were read aloud in the mess hall, each one a small eruption of relief and fear. The men cheered when someone's turn came, but their joy was always tempered by uncertainty. Home was not what it once was. Home was rubble, ration cards, and silence. Bauer's name was finally called in early September. He was to be sent through New York, then to a British processing camp, and eventually repatriated to Bremen. For 2 days, he walked around in a daze, watching the place that had reshaped him. The classrooms were nearly empty now, their chalkboards faintly dusted with ghostly white words: freedom, law, responsibility. In the workshop, the smell of oil and sawdust lingered like memory. On his final morning, he stopped by Professor Whitmore's office. The man was packing up papers. His assignment at Ruston was over too. "You're going home, Sergeant," Whitmore said with a tired smile. "I suppose that makes us both free men again." Bauer stood at the doorway, cap in hand. "You've given us more than I expected. Maybe more than we deserved." Whitmore shook his head. "No, you earned it. Learning's a kind of courage. Some men never find it, even outside a prison." They shook hands, a soldier and a teacher, both marked by the same war in different ways. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Bauer asked quietly, "Do you think Germany can change?" Whitmore thought for a moment, then said, "If enough of you go home believing it can, then yes." Later that day, the prisoners assembled by the main gate. Trucks waited with faded U.S. Army markings, their engines idling. Captain Briggs, immaculate in her uniform, called the names one last time. "Hauptfeldwebel Wilhelm Bauer, Transport Convoy 4. He stepped forward. Briggs saluted him briskly, and he returned it with equal precision. But then, almost as an afterthought, she said softly, "Good luck, Sergeant, and don't stop learning." He climbed into the truck, joining the others. As it rolled away, the camp faded behind them, towers shrinking into the horizon, fences dissolving into the glare of the afternoon light. Some men waved back. Others couldn't bear to look. The convoy traveled for days across the American landscape, through pine forests, over bridges, past endless fields of corn and cotton. Bauer pressed his face to the window of the transport truck. America unfolded before him like a living textbook, cities humming with industry, farms vast and ordered, people walking freely between them. It struck him that this too had been part of his education, the quiet lesson of a nation that believed in building rather than conquering. When the ship finally departed New York Harbor, he stood on deck with a handful of others. The Statue of Liberty rose in the distance, her torch glinting in the late sun. None of them spoke for a long time. Then Dietrich, who stood beside him, said, "Strange, isn't it? To leave a prison and feel like we're losing something." Bauer nodded. "Not losing," he said. "Carrying it home." 2 months later, he stepped off a transport in Bremen. The city was a skeleton of its former self. Walls blown open, streets littered with twisted iron. His sister met him at the edge of the ruins, thin and pale but alive. When she asked what America had been like, he didn't know how to begin. He simply handed her a small envelope of papers. His study notes, his correspondence certificates, and a letter of recommendation signed by Professor Alan Whitmore. "LSU, America taught me," he said softly, "that strength isn't fear, it's understanding." That winter, Bauer began teaching mechanical repair at a provisional trade school established by the British occupation forces. He used the same chalkboard lessons he'd learned at Ruston. The students were young, some barely 16, and many had never seen peace. To them, his stories about classrooms behind barbed wire sounded impossible, but when he told them, his voice carried the quiet conviction of a man who had seen the worst of humanity and been offered, in return, a second education. Years later, when Camp Ruston was dismantled and the last tower torn down, an American historian found a faded note tucked inside one of the old desks, Written in careful German script, it said, "They tried to teach us freedom and we thought it was a trick. But freedom, we learned, is simply the courage to think." No one ever confirmed who had written it. But those who knew Bauer suspected it was his hand, and so, long after the guns fell silent, long after the last prisoner went home, the experiment at Camp Ruston remained one of the quietest victories of the war, proof that even in captivity,